Hello everyone, my name is Jan, Arts. I'm a self-taught artist and I've learned all of my drawing skills with the help of books and other people's tutorials. I think it's time for me to give back to the art community by sharing my experience. In this tutorial, I'm going to tell you how I use Clip Studio Paint tools to make shading of a portrait easy and fast. To do so, I will guide you through all the steps I make to create a portrait like this. Here are the steps. Sketch, light source and shadow shapes, local color blocking, soft shadows, soft light, deeper shadows, reflected light and highlights, details, editing and special effects. I will also share some tips on organizing your layers, using clipping mask, lasso tool and layer blending modes to achieve nice effects. This is the reference picture I will be using. Clip Studio Paint offers a huge variety of preset and custom-made brushes. Here's the list of brushes I mostly use while painting. Preset: dense watercolor, transparent watercolor, smooth watercolor, opaque watercolor, and soft airbrush. The custom brushes I mostly use are Photoshop brush and Mirror's Blender. You can download them for free from Clip Studio Paint's assets. I will leave the links in this video's description. So, let's start drawing. Since this video is focused on painting shadows and coloring, I decided to draw the sketch beforehand so we can move right on to our main subject. I used the PS brush to create the sketch, and my main goal was to make a clean and simple design, which is much easier to work with in this technique. I prefer to use a semi-soft brush for my sketches since it's easier to blend the sketch into a painting later on if the lines are not rough. Light source. I've chosen this reference because it's rather easy to see where the light comes from and how it hits the planes of the face and where the most prominent shadows fall. Also, we should note the reflected light. It's where the light falls on the shoulder and reflects on the jaw. There's also some cool greenish reflected light on the back. After analyzing the reference, I create a separate layer, which will serve as my guide to the shadow shapes without messing up my lineup. Color blocking. Now I need to block in the local colors. Local color means the actual color of the surface, uninfluenced by surroundings and light sources. Of course, I don't know for sure the local colors of my model, but that's what creative freedom and artist interpretation is for. Long story short, I guess after some observation that skin is a neutral yellowish orange and hair is a reddish brown. Both colors are rather desaturated and I recommend starting like this and add some brighter hues later in the process. First of all, I adjust my bucket tool properties like this. Now I create another layer under my line art. Then I click on my line art layer and set it to a reference mode by clicking on the lighthouse button. So now I can go back to my new layer, I can call it skin or something, and block in the skin color. Click and hold, and then move your bucket tool around your artwork. All selected areas will fill in automatically. Repeat the color blocking with the hair on a separate layer. After that, I hide the line art and clean up both of my local color layers, filling the gaps and evening the edges to avoid fuzziness. Now we can finally start working on shadows. I create another layer above my skin local color layer and then turn it into a clipping mask by clicking the Clip to Layer Below button in the layer menu. After adjusting the clipping mask mode, I make my shadow map layer visible, choosing the soft airbrush, set it to size 500 or 600. Well, try it yourself and you will see which size is easier for you to control and which works better for your computer, but keep in mind that brush size should be quite large. And after that, I start painting in the shadows, following the shapes I have mapped before. I use a cool bluish color for the shadow. And here's the trick. Since I'm using a soft airbrush, this color will be layered above my local color with a transparent soft stroke. As a result, those two colors will mix with each other. If I only use one hue, the blue, it will look boring. So I drop in some more violet hues and some hints on reddish orange and teal green reflected light. By doing so, I get the variety of colors in my shadows to work with, and it creates interest. At this point, my goal is to create the color palette and the mood, so my color variety is vibrant and all hues work well together. You can experiment with different hues and see how they work together for you. I've learned this from watercolor painting and transferred this technique into my digital artworks. When I'm happy with my color draft, I set the airbrush to smaller size and clean up the edges of shadow a little bit, using my shadow map as reference. Then I use a blender brush to smooth out color transitions and mix my colors even more so they organically flow into one another. Soft light. Now, when I have my shadows drafted, I need to map out my light. I create another layer under my shadow layer, also apply clipping mask to it so it clips to a local color layer, not the shadow one. Using the same soft airbrush, I drop in the light with very pale, warm yellowish color. I've got to be careful and not to overwork it so it doesn't look too light. Well, now I've got my shadows and lighter areas, but the picture still looks too pale without more saturated colors. It's time to add them. I create another clipping mask layer above the two previous layers and use soft airbrush to paint in some blush on the cheeks, around the eyes where the skin is thinner and the blood vessels are closer to the surface, and brighten up the lips. Since I'm using clipping mask layers, I can experiment with hues I want to add as much as I need to until I'm totally happy with the result. So I can let myself go and go totally crazy with the makeup and try any color I want to until it looks nice to me. But anyway, my previous work won't be ruined, so I have no limits and no restrictions to my creative imagination. After that, I repeat the same steps with the hair, adding shadows and light and some brighter hues by using clipping mask layers one above the other. Now my color draft is ready, the colors look quite nice together and I have my values mapped in. I merge the clipping masks layers of the skin with the skin local color layer and repeat the same with the hair layers. So now I have two separate skin and hair color draft layers. Deeper shadows, reflected light and highlights. That's where all the fun begins. I create another clipping mask layer above my skin layer and start sculpting the face by adding more shadows, strengthening the contrast by adding more saturated colors, sharpening the edges, adding more prominent reflected light and highlights. I stick to the hard edge, soft edge rule, so if my stroke or plane has a hard edge, the other edge somewhere of the same stroke or plane should be soft. I always use my shadow map as a reference to make sure I follow the shapes of the shadows correctly. I find it very useful not to stay in one area of my painting for too long and work on all parts of the painting so they are all approximately on the same level of progression. At some point, I hide the line art completely and start working without it, adding details and darker values where they are needed. I constantly switch between harder and softer brushes to achieve the best result. I go back to the hair. I create a new clipping mask layer above it. Well, you know the routine by now. Here I will show you another trick I often use with hair and with clothes. I use the lasso tool to select some sections of the hair and fill it with color using a soft watercolor brush. This technique helps me model the values and sharp edges and see how my color choices work together. I wasn't too happy with what I've got, to be honest, so I blended it all back and painted it in new. Happens even to the best of us, you know. But it still helped me to envision my values and shapes. So this technique is still super useful and can be used in many cases and styles. Details. We are getting closer to the final now. Now it's time to add details and blend the skin and hair layers together so they look organic. I merge clipping mask layers with their base layers first, and then merge hair and skin layers together. I paint shadows under the hair and soften the edges of the hairline so the color transition between hair and skin looks natural. Then I paint in some more details and highlights and smudge some parts of hair and skin where they meet the background to add more dynamic and IRL feeling. This is of course absolutely my personal artistic choice and you don't have to do this, but this is also sticking to the hard edge, soft edge rule. Now we will add some special effects to make our portrait pop out. The shadows looks best with proper lighting. I will show you how to use Clip Studio Paint's blending modes to achieve some nice lighting effects. Create another layer on top of your painting and set the blending mode to color dodge. You can also try using Add Glow mode. It will give a much brighter effect. Have fun, play with it, let it surprise you. In this blending mode, I add more saturated highlights with a soft brush using a very light yellowish color. I can see that my painting still lacks some interest, so I set the color of my background to teal green. It supports the greenish hues in my shadows and the reflected light. I make my line art visible again and set it to overlay mode. Then reduce the opacity to 17% and delete the lines that don't look good, only leaving those that add to the whole picture. Though this step is completely optional, I still use it quite often to boost some of the shadows and small details. Now I merge all the layers, go to Edit, Tonal Correction, Tone Curve and play with it until I am completely happy with the contrast. Well, we're almost done, and here's a final step I'm going to make. It's also optional, but I like how it works with my painting. So I create another layer on top of my painting, then go to Filter, Render, Perlin Noise and set it to these parameters. Then I set the layer to Hard Light mode and voila! We have some nice texture blending all colors together and giving the painting a less blendy look. I hope this tutorial was helpful and easy to understand. If you like it, I would appreciate if you leave your likes both here on YouTube and on the Clip Studio page so more people could see that my work is useful and worthy of their attention. This tutorial, along with lots of my other work, was created with the great support of my patrons. You can also support me on Patreon following this link. During those hard times, I post all of my content to all patrons regardless of tier. Stay safe and subscribe to my channel for more interesting art videos.